Picture this. You're 8 months pregnant with twins. Your CEO husband just left you for a 26-year-old model. You have $0 in your bank account. And tomorrow morning, police are coming to arrest you for crimes he committed. That was my Tuesday. By Friday, I'd given birth in a jail cell. By Monday, the viral video of my humiliation had 30 million views. Everyone thought I was done, destroyed, another rich wife who got what she deserved. But they didn't know about the documents my father left me, the ones that proved everything. Drop a like if you want to see how this ends. Because the courtroom scene chef's kiss. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling penthouse as Grace Holloway stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling over her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant with twins, she'd spent the afternoon preparing Blake's favorite dinner for his investor meeting. Roasted chicken, herb potatoes, the works. But Blake Sterling, her husband of 6 years, hadn't even texted to say he'd be late. When the elevator finally chimed at 11 p.m., Grace felt her stomach drop. Blake walked in, loosening his tie, eyes glued to his phone. The scent of unfamiliar perfume drifted across the marble floor. "Long day?" Grace asked, her voice careful, exhausting. He didn't look up. "Those Boston investors are impossible." Grace's pulse quickened. "Boston? I thought the meeting was downtown." Blake finally glanced at her, irritation flashing across his handsome face. It was both. Conference call from Boston, then dinner with the Chicago group. Why the interrogation? "I'm not interrogating. I just wanted to know when my husband would be home." He exhaled sharply. "You're letting yourself go." "Grace, investors notice these things. Image matters in this business." The words hit harder than a slap. Grace looked down at her maternity dress, suddenly feeling enormous and foolish. "I'm pregnant, Blake, with your children." "I know that." He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. "I'm going to bed. Don't wake me when you come up." Grace stood alone in the kitchen, Lake Michigan glittering beyond the windows like 1,000 watching eyes. Something felt wrong, desperately wrong. She walked to the coat closet where Blake had tossed his jacket. Her hands shook as she searched the pockets. The hotel receipt was folded neatly in the inner pocket. Presidential suite, the Drake Hotel, Chicago. Last night, the same night Blake claimed he was in Boston for an emergency board meeting. Grace's knees buckled. She gripped the kitchen counter, the cold marble anchoring her to reality. Her husband was lying, the man she'd built her entire life around. The man she'd given up her marketing career for was lying to her face. She thought about confronting him immediately, but something stopped her. Maybe exhaustion, maybe fear, maybe the twins kicking inside her, reminding her that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Grace slipped the receipt back into Blake's pocket and walked to the guest bedroom, where she spent the night staring at the ceiling, feeling her world crumble silently around her. The next morning, Grace decided to surprise Blake at work. She packed his favorite lunch, told herself she was being paranoid, and drove to Sterling Technologies headquarters in the Loop. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly, went pale when Grace approached. "Is Blake available?" Grace asked. "I brought him lunch," Kelly stammered. He's in a meeting. A very important meeting." Grace smiled tightly. "I'll just pop up. I still have my old executive badge." Before Kelly could protest, Grace was in the elevator, her heart pounding. She'd worked at Sterling Technologies for 3 years before Blake convinced her to step down after their wedding. "Focus on building our home," he'd said. "I'll build the empire." The elevator doors opened on the executive floor. Grace walked down the familiar hallway, past curious stares from employees who remembered when she'd been vice president of marketing. Blake's office door was slightly ajar. Grace pushed it open. The scene burned itself into her memory with brutal clarity. Blake sat on the edge of his desk, his hands on the waist of a stunning woman in designer lingerie. Tessa Vaughn. Grace recognized her from fashion magazines. The woman had long auburn hair, perfect skin, and was currently kissing Grace's husband. Blake looked up. No shock, no guilt, just irritation. "Jesus, Grace, you can't just walk in here." Grace couldn't breathe. The room spun. One of the twins kicked hard, and she gasped, clutching her stomach. Tessa turned, smirking. Oh, you're the wife. Blake said you were understanding about arrangements. Get out, Blake said to Grace, his voice cold as steel. This is my workplace. You're embarrassing yourself. I'm embarrassing myself, Grace's voice cracked. Blake, I'm pregnant with your children. He stood, buttoning his shirt. And that gives you the right to barge into my office during business hours. I'm calling security. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. This couldn't be real. This man, this stranger wearing her husband's face, was calling security on her. Employees had gathered in the hallway, phones raised, recording everything. Two security guards appeared. Mrs. Sterling, we need you to leave the premises. Blake, please, Grace whispered. Don't make a scene, he said flatly. We'll talk at home. But as the guards escorted her toward the elevator, Grace heard Tessa's laugh echo down the hallway. That's when the contraction hit. Not real labor, the doctor would later tell her, but false labor triggered by severe stress. Grace doubled over, gasping, and the guards had to half carry her to the elevator while dozens of Sterling Technologies employees watched and recorded. By the time Grace reached her car, shaking and humiliated, the video was already trending online. Blake didn't come home that night, or the next. On the third day, he finally appeared at the penthouse with a thin man in an expensive suit. Grace, this is Randall Moss, my attorney. Grace sat on the couch, exhausted. She'd barely slept, barely eaten. The twins had been restless, as if sensing their mother's distress. Blake, can we talk alone? No, Randall's here because we need to finalize some things. Blake sat across from her, his posture stiff and formal. This marriage isn't working. I've filed for divorce. The words landed like bullets. Grace stared at him, unable to process. You've what? Filed for divorce. Tessa and I are moving to Los Angeles. I'm launching Sterling West, a new division. You can keep the Chicago penthouse. For now. Grace's hands went to her belly. Blake, I'm 8 months pregnant with twins. Your twins. We'll do a DNA test after they're born, Blake said, as if discussing a quarterly report. Assuming they're mine, I'll provide child support. But I'm not interested in playing house. Randall cleared his throat. Mrs. Sterling, we're prepared to offer you $2 million as part of the settlement. In exchange, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding your marriage and any knowledge of Sterling Technologies' business practices. You'll also relinquish any claims to company assets. Grace felt like she was drowning. Any claims, Blake? I worked at that company for 3 years. I helped build the marketing division. Under my leadership, Blake corrected. And you left voluntarily. You have no ownership stake. Because you asked me to leave. You said we were building a life together. Blake stood. Sign the papers by tomorrow morning. And you get $2 million. Wait any longer. And the offer drops to $500,000. Your choice. He walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Grace, I've frozen the joint accounts and credit cards. Liability protection during the divorce. I'm sure you understand. Then he was gone. Randall placed a stack of documents on the coffee table and followed Blake out. Grace sat in stunned silence. She picked up her phone to call her best friend, Jenna. But the call went to voicemail. She tried her credit card to order dinner. Declined. She checked her bank account. Zero balance. With a note, account frozen pending legal review. Blake had cut off her access to everything. Grace walked to the bedroom, lay down, and finally let herself cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. The twins kicked frantically, and she whispered to them through her tears. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Mommy's going to figure this out, I promise. But she had no idea how. The next morning, Grace woke to her phone buzzing. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Hello, silence. Then a man's voice, older. Careful. Grace Holloway, don't sign anything Blake gives you. Go to Bank of America on Wacker Drive. Safety deposit box number 447. Use the emergency key your father gave you. Do this today. Who is this? A friend of your father's. Someone who's been waiting for this day. Go now, Grace, before Blake realizes what you're looking for. The line went dead. Grace sat up, her heart racing. The emergency key, she'd almost forgotten about it. Her father, Nate Holloway, had given it to her 2 years before he died, saying, if anything ever happens to me and you need answers, this key will help. She'd tucked it away in her jewelry box, never thinking she'd need it. Grace dressed quickly, grabbed the key, and took an Uber to the bank. The driver gave her sympathetic looks in the rearview mirror. She wondered if he'd seen the viral video of her humiliation. At the bank, the manager escorted her to the vault. Box 447 was medium-sized, tucked in the corner. Grace's hands shook as she turned the key. Inside was a manila envelope, yellowed with age, and a letter in her father's handwriting. "My dearest Grace," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and something has gone terribly wrong with Blake. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have seen it sooner." Grace's vision blurred with tears. The envelope contains the original incorporation documents for Holloway Technologies. That's the real name of the company Blake calls Sterling Technologies. I owned 65%. My partner Warren Caldwell owned 35%. Blake Sterling owned nothing. He came into our company as a junior analyst and charmed his way into your life. When I discovered he was planning to push me out and take control, I created this insurance policy. Grace, the company is yours. It was always meant to be yours. If you're reading this, Blake has betrayed you. Don't let him steal your birthright. Trust Warren. He'll help you fight. Love always. Dad. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were pristine incorporation documents, notarized and official, showing that Holloway Technologies had never legally transferred ownership to Blake Sterling. Her father had created a complex trust structure that made Grace the sole heir. For the first time in days, Grace felt something other than despair. She felt anger. Grace called Jenna Price the moment that she left the bank. Jenna, her college roommate and now a corporate attorney at a prestigious loop firm, answered on the first ring. "Grace, thank God I've been trying to reach you. Your calls were going straight to voicemail." "Blake blocked my number on your phone somehow," Grace said. "Jenna, I need you. Right now. I can't explain over the phone." 90 minutes later, they sat in a conference room at Jenna's office. Documents spread across the table. Jenna, a sharp woman with short, dark hair and fierce intelligence, read through the papers with growing astonishment. "Grace, do you understand what you're holding? My father's company, the one Blake stole?" "Not just that," Jenna tapped the incorporation documents. "If these are legitimate, and I believe they are because your father was meticulous, then Blake has been committing fraud for 5 years. He changed the company name after your dad died, forged transfer documents, and used your signature as Nate's heir without your knowledge or consent. This isn't just divorce drama. This is federal crime territory." Grace felt the twinge shift inside her. "Can we prove it? We'll need expert verification on the documents. But Grace, your father dated these papers and had them notarized by 3 separate witnesses. Warren Caldwell's signature is here too." Jenna looked up. "Have you spoken to Warren?" "Not in years. Dad's funeral was the last time. He moved to Florida, I think." Jenna's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. "It's a video call request. From Warren Caldwell." They stared at each other. Then Jenna accepted the call. An elderly man appeared on the screen. He had silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and wore a crisp white shirt despite the Florida heat visible through the window behind him. "Grace Holloway, you found your father's gift." Grace leaned toward the screen. "Mr. Caldwell, did you send me that message?" "I did. I've been monitoring Blake Sterling for 3 years, waiting for him to make his final move. Leaving you while pregnant was predictable. Cruel men follow patterns." While Warren's voice was calm but edged with steel. "Your father made me promise something before he died. He said, 'Warren, if Blake ever turns on Grace, you help her take back what's ours.' Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because you needed to see Blake's true nature yourself. If I'd approached you 2 years ago, you would have defended him. Love makes us blind. Grace, but betrayal opens our eyes." Jenna interjected. "Mr. Caldwell, what evidence do you have of Blake's fraud?" Warren smiled grimly. "Everything. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, falsified board meeting minutes, email chains between Blake and his foe, Derek Morrison, discussing how to keep Grace in the dark. I've been forwarding copies to a federal prosecutor friend of mine for the past 18 months. Grace felt hope surge through her chest for the first time in weeks. "So we can stop him." "Better than that," We can destroy him. Warren leaned closer to the camera. But we have to be smart. Blake's already moved against you with the divorce filing and financial cutoff. He's going to escalate. When cornered, narcissists become dangerous. Jenna nodded. We need a strategy. Grace, you're vulnerable right now. Pregnant, financially dependent. Not completely dependent, Grace said quietly. I have the emergency credit card my father gave me years ago. Separate account, not connected to Blake. About 10,000 on it. That'll help, Jenna said. But we need more. We need to catch Blake in the act of committing a new crime. One the authorities can't ignore. Warren's expression turned calculating. He's planning to launch Sterling West in Los Angeles next month. To do that, he'll need to transfer significant company assets from Chicago. If we can prove those transfers are illegal, that he's moving money that isn't his to move, we've got him. How long do we have? Grace asked. 4 weeks, maybe 5. Warren's eyes softened. Grace, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Blake will come after you with everything he has. Are you prepared for that? Grace looked down at her belly, where her sons were growing. She thought about her father, about the company he'd built, about the future Blake was trying to steal. Yes, she said. I'm ready. But she had no idea just how brutal Blake's next move would be. 3 days later, Grace left her prenatal appointment at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The twins were healthy, the doctor assured her, due in 3 weeks. Right on schedule. Grace felt cautiously optimistic as she walked through the parking garage toward her car. Grace Sterling, she turned. 2 men in suits approached. They had badges clipped to their belts. Yes, Chicago Police Department. Ma'am, you're under arrest for embezzlement and corporate espionage. Grace's world tilted. What? There's a mistake. The detective, a tired-looking man in his 50s, pulled out handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Wait, please. I'm pregnant. I didn't do anything. Your husband filed a complaint yesterday, claims you stole proprietary documents from Sterling Technologies and transferred company funds to an offshore account in your name. We have a warrant for your arrest. Grace's mind raced. Blake had planted evidence? Of course he had. I need to call my attorney. You can call from the station. They handcuffed her right there in the parking garage, while other patients and visitors stared. Someone filmed it on their phone. Grace felt her face burn with humiliation as they led her to an unmarked car. At the police station, they processed her like any other criminal. Fingerprints, mugshot. The twins kicked frantically. Sensing their mother's panic, Grace was shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone when they finally let her make her call. Jenna, they arrested me. Blake said I embezzled money. Jenna's voice was tight with fury. Don't say anything to anyone. Not a word. I'm on my way. The bail hearing was a nightmare. Grace stood before the judge, 8 months pregnant and terrified, while Blake's attorneys painted her as a vengeful wife who'd stolen company funds when she realized her marriage was ending. Your Honor, Jenna argued, my client is pregnant with twins, due in 3 weeks. She has no criminal record. She's not a flight risk. The prosecutor, a severe woman in her 40s, countered. Mrs. Sterling has significant motive and the technical skills to commit these crimes. She previously worked in the company's executive suite and had access to sensitive systems. Furthermore, she has dual citizenship. I don't have dual citizenship, Grace whispered to Jenna. They're lying. Jenna whispered back. The judge set bail at $500,000. Grace couldn't afford it. Neither could Jenna. Warren was in Florida, and transferring that kind of money would take days. Bail is denied pending psychiatric evaluation, the judge ruled. The defendant will be held at Cook County Jail. Grace felt her legs give out. Jenna caught her. Your Honor, please, she's pregnant. The jail has a medical ward. Next case. They took Grace away in handcuffs. Cook County Jail was hell. Grace was placed in the women's general population because the medical ward was overcrowded. The other inmates recognized her immediately. The viral video had made her infamous. You're that rich bitch CEO's wife, a woman with face tattoos sneered. Think you're better than us. Grace kept her head down, terrified. She'd never been in a fight in her life. She pressed her hands to her belly. protecting her sons. On the third night, the contractions started, real ones this time. Grace gasped, doubling over on her bunk. Help! Please, something's wrong. The guard called for medical. They rushed her to the prison medical ward, but it was too late to stop the labor. Grace was going into premature delivery, 3 weeks early, in a county jail. The twins were coming. The delivery room in Cook County Jail's medical ward was nothing like Grace had imagined for her son's birth. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sickly yellow shadows across peeling paint. The air smelled of disinfectant and desperation, and a handcuff secured Grace's right wrist to the bed rail, standard protocol for inmates giving birth. Please, Grace begged the nurse, a kind-faced woman in her 50s named Patricia. Please take the handcuff off. I'm not going to run anywhere. I can barely walk. Patricia's eyes were sympathetic, but she shook her head. I'm sorry, honey. It's policy. I don't make the rules. I wish I could help you. Grace looked at the metal restraint biting into her swollen wrist and felt tears burn her eyes. This wasn't how motherhood was supposed to begin. She'd imagined soft lighting, Blake holding her hand, a photographer capturing the precious first moments. Instead, she was alone, shackled like a common criminal, about to bring her sons into a world that had already judged them guilty by association. The contractions came fast and brutal, each one stealing her breath. Grace had attended birthing classes, practiced breathing techniques, made elaborate plans for a peaceful water birth with aromatherapy and soft music. All of that felt like a cruel joke now. The only music was the beeping of monitors and the distant sound of guards shouting at other inmates. You're doing great, Patricia said, checking Grace's dilation. You're at 7 centimeters, won't be long now. How long? Grace gasped between contractions. With twins. Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be 5. Every birth is different. 5 hours. Grace didn't know if she could endure 5 more hours of this pain, but she didn't have a choice. Her sons were coming, whether she was ready or not. Through the small window in the door, Grace could see a guard stationed outside. A woman in her 30s, arms crossed, face impassive. Grace wondered what the guard thought of her. Did she believe the embezzlement charges? Did she think Grace was just another wealthy criminal who'd gotten greedy? Another contraction hit. This one so powerful that Grace screamed. The sound echoed off the cinder block walls, raw and primal. That's it, Patricia encouraged. Don't hold back. Nobody here to impress. Just let your body do what it needs to do. Grace thought about Blake. Was he sleeping peacefully in some luxury hotel in Los Angeles right now? Was Tessa beside him, her perfect body unmarred by pregnancy? Did he ever think about Grace, alone and suffering? The anger that thought sparked gave Grace strength. She wouldn't let Blake's cruelty break her. Her sons deserved a mother who fought, not one who gave up. Hours crawled by. Patricia stayed with her through every contraction, every moment of agony. At one point, Grace grabbed the nurse's hand so hard she was afraid she'd break bones. I'm sorry, Grace sobbed. I'm so sorry. Honey, I've had 3 kids of my own. You're not even close to the hardest grip I've felt. Patricia wiped Grace's forehead with a cool cloth. You're strong, stronger than you know. Any woman who can give birth in a place like this is a warrior. At 3 in the morning, 10 hours after labor began, a doctor finally arrived. Dr. Chen was a tired-looking woman who'd clearly been woken from sleep. She examined Grace quickly and efficiently. Okay, Mom, time to push. First baby's crowning. Grace bore down with everything she had. The pain was beyond anything she'd ever experienced. A tearing, burning sensation that consumed her entire world. She screamed again, not caring who heard. One more push, Dr. Chen commanded. Come on, you can do this. While Grace pushed with a guttural cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. And suddenly, miraculously, the pressure released. A baby's cry pierced the air, high-pitched, furious. Alive! It's a boy, Dr. Chen announced, holding up a tiny, red-faced infant covered in vernix. A healthy baby boy. Patricia quickly cleaned him and placed him on Grace's chest. Grace's free hand came up to touch him, her fingers trembling. He was so small, so perfect. Dark hair plastered to his head, eyes squeezed shut, tiny fists waving in protest at being thrust into the world. "Hi, baby," Grace whispered through her tears. "Hi, Lucas. Mommy's here." But there was no time to bond. Another contraction gripped her, and Patricia had to take Lucas away. "Second baby's coming," Dr. Chen said. "This one's in a hurry." 3 minutes later, after two more excruciating pushes, Riley James Holloway made his entrance. He was smaller than his brother, but his lungs were just as powerful. His cry joined Lucas's in a duet of newborn indignation. Dr. Chen placed Riley on Grace's chest beside his brother. Grace looked down at her sons, both screaming, both perfect, and felt her heart crack open with love so fierce it was almost painful. "You're here," she sobbed. "You're both here. You're safe. Mommy's got you." She tried to hold them both with her one free hand, the handcuff rattling against the bed rail with every movement. The indignity of it burned. But Grace pushed that feeling aside. Her sons were healthy. That was all that mattered. Patricia took photos with Grace's phone, images Grace knew she'd treasure forever despite the terrible circumstances. In the pictures, you couldn't see the handcuff or the peeling paint, just a mother and her newborn sons, their first moments together. As the medical team cleaned up and the twins were weighed and measured, Grace felt exhaustion crash over her like a wave. But beneath the exhaustion was something else, something new and powerful. Purpose. These boys needed her. They needed her to be strong, to fight, to win. Blake had tried to destroy her, but he'd miscalculated. He'd given her the most powerful motivation in the world. Patricia brought the twins back, now cleaned and swaddled in standard-issue hospital blankets. She helped Grace position them for their first feeding, working around the handcuff with practiced efficiency. "You're a natural," Patricia said softly. "They're lucky to have you." Grace looked up at the nurse, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for being kind, for treating me like a person. Honey, I don't know what you're accused of doing, and frankly, I don't care. Right now, you're just a mama with her babies. That's all that matters to me." After Patricia left, Grace lay in the hospital bed, both twins sleeping on her chest, and allowed herself a moment of peace. Outside the window, she could see the Chicago skyline in the pre-dawn darkness. Somewhere out there, Blake was sleeping soundly, believing he'd won, but he hadn't won, not yet. And if Grace had anything to say about it, he never would. She kissed each of her sons on their fuzzy heads and whispered a promise. "I will protect you. I will fight for you. And I will make sure you grow up in a world where your father can never hurt us again." The twins stirred but didn't wake. Grace closed her eyes, her body aching, her wrist raw from the handcuff, her heart fuller than it had ever been. She'd given birth in a jail cell, but her sons had given her something invaluable in return. They'd given her a reason to become someone new, someone stronger, someone Blake Sterling would learn to fear. At 2 in the morning, exactly 1 week after Grace's release, someone knocked on her sister's apartment door. Grace, exhausted from night feedings, almost didn't answer, but something made her look through the peephole. Tessa Vaughn stood in the hallway. Grace yanked open this door. "You've got to be kidding me." Tessa looked different than she had in Blake's office. No makeup, hair in a messy ponytail, expensive clothes replaced with jeans and a sweatshirt, and her eyes were red from crying. "Please," Tessa said, "I need to talk to you. 5 minutes. You ruined my life. Blake ruined both our lives. Please, Grace, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm begging you." Against her better judgment, Grace let her in. They sat at the kitchen table. Awkward, intense. "Talk," Grace said. Tessa pulled out her phone. "Blake told me he'd marry me after the divorce. Said we'd build Sterling West together. That I'd be the face of the company's luxury division. He even had me sign paperwork. I thought it was for business licenses. What was it really? Shell companies, all in my name, using my social security number, my passport, everything." Tessa's voice cracked. "I found the documents last week. Blake's been moving money through companies that exist only on paper. If anyone investigates, I'm the one who goes to prison, not him." Grace felt a chill. "He's framing you. Just like he framed you. I was so stupid. Grace, I thought he loved me. I thought I was special. Tessa wiped her eyes. I recorded some of our conversations. I didn't trust him completely. Even then, on one of the recordings, he talks about his plan. He calls us both disposable. Said once Sterling West launches, he'll blame everything on, and I quote, two stupid women who couldn't see they were being used. Grace's hands clenched. Do you still have the recording? Tessa handed over a USB drive. Everything's on here. Text messages, emails I pulled from his laptop when he was sleeping, bank account numbers, and the audio files. Grace plugged the drive into her laptop. The first audio file made her stomach turn. Blake's voice, smooth and cold. Tessa's perfect for this. Model looks, no business sense. If the feds come sniffing, they'll assume she's the mastermind trying to play innocent. And Grace, she's already destroyed. No one will believe her over me. It's almost too easy. Grace looked at Tessa, who was crying silently. Despite everything, Grace felt pity. They'd both been weapons Blake used against themselves. Why come to me? Grace asked. Because you're fighting back. I saw the news about the charges being dropped. Blake was furious. He made a call to someone, threatened them. I realized he's scared of you, Grace. And if he's scared, that means you have power. Grace thought about it, about revenge, about justice, about the twins sleeping in the next room. If we do this, if we take Blake down together, everyone will know what you did. Your career, your reputation, all of it. I don't care anymore. Tessa's voice was fierce. He made me into a villain. Fine, but I'll be the villain who tells the truth. Grace made a decision. She called Warren despite the late hour. He answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. We have more evidence, Grace said, and an unexpected ally. Warren listened as Grace explained. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Grace, this changes everything. With Tessa's testimony and evidence, we don't just have a case. We have a slam dunk, but we need to move fast. Blake's Sterling West launch is in 4 days. What do you need us to do? Nothing yet. Let me coordinate with my contacts. In the meantime, both of you stay safe. Blake is most dangerous when he's cornered. After the call ended, Grace looked at Tessa. There's a couch in the living room. You can stay tonight if you need to. Tessa nodded gratefully. Thank you. And Grace, I really am sorry. For everything. Grace didn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But they had a common enemy now. And sometimes that was enough. Warren's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would call an emergency board meeting at Sterling Technologies' Chicago headquarters. Blake, confident in his control, would attend, and that's when they'd spring the trap. The morning of the meeting, Grace stood in front of her sister's bathroom mirror, trying to steady her nerves. She'd lost weight since the twins' birth, and her clothes hung loose, but her eyes were different, harder, clearer. Jenna arrived to pick her up, ready, as I'll ever be. They drove to Sterling Tower in silence. Tessa met them in the parking garage, wearing a simple black dress and oversized sunglasses. He can't know I'm here until the right moment, Tessa said. Warren had arranged everything. The board members, carefully selected, had already seen preliminary evidence. Derek Morrison, the CFO, had flipped entirely, providing testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. And FBI agents were stationed in the building, waiting. The boardroom was on the 40th floor, with sweeping views of Chicago. Grace entered first, taking her seat at the head of the table, the chair her father had sat in. The board members filed in, curious and tense. Blake arrived last, confident as always. Then he saw Grace. What the hell is she doing here? Warren, seated to Grace's right, spoke calmly. Grace Holloway has every right to be here. In fact, she has more right than you do. This is my company, Blake snarled. Actually, us, Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. It's not, it never was. She nodded to Jenna, who projected the original incorporation documents onto the screen. The board members leaned forward, reading. Holloway Technologies, Grace continued. That's the real name of this company. My father, Nate Holloway, owns 65%. Warren Caldwell owned 35%. You, Blake, owned nothing. Blake's face went white, then red. Those documents are fake. They're notarized, dated, and verified by 3 independent forensic experts. Jenna said, "You changed the company name after Nate's death and forged transfer documents. That's corporate fraud. You can't prove intent." Blake shot back. Warren smiled coldly. "Actually, we can." The next slide showed email exchanges between Blake and Derek Morrison. Blake's words, damning and clear: "Make sure the old man's shares get buried in probate. Grace is too trusting to question anything. By the time she figures it out, I'll have full control." Blake lunged toward the screen. "That's taken out of context. Is this?" Grace pressed play on the audio file Tessa had provided. Blake's voice filled the room. "Tessa's disposable. Once Sterling West launches, I'll blame everything on her and Grace. 2 stupid women. It's almost too easy." The board members exchanged shocked glances. Blake's face contorted with rage. "Where did you get that?" Tessa walked into the room. "From my phone, Blake. I recorded everything." Blake stared at her. "Betrayed. You traitor." "No," Tessa said quietly. "I'm a survivor." Grace stood. "To Blake Sterling, you stole my father's company, committed fraud, embezzled funds, and framed 2 women for your crimes. The FBI has been investigating you for 6 months. They have everything they need." On cue, the boardroom doors opened. 3 FBI agents entered. "Blake Sterling, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, and corporate malfeasance." Blake's composure finally shattered. "You can't do this. I built this company. Me, not some dead man who got lucky." The agents cuffed him. Blake struggled, wild-eyed. "Grace, you're making a mistake. Those twins, they're mine. You'll regret this." "The only thing I regret," Grace said softly, "is believing you ever loved me." They dragged him out, still shouting threats. The room was silent. Then Warren stood and began to clap. Slowly, the board members joined in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Warren said, "I propose we vote on new leadership. All in favor of appointing Grace Holloway as CEO of Holloway Technologies." Every hand went up. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. "I accept. And the first thing I'm doing is renaming this company officially. We're going back to Holloway Technologies. My father's legacy will be honored." After the meeting, Warren pulled Grace aside. "Your father would be proud." "There's more, isn't there?" Grace asked. "You said he left me something else." Warren smiled. "Come to my office tomorrow. There's one more gift your father left you, a contingency plan he put in place years ago." That night, Grace returned to her sister's apartment, exhausted but victorious. She checked on the twins, both sleeping peacefully, and allowed herself a moment of pure relief. She'd won. Blake was going to prison. The company was hers. But as she'd learned, in battles like these, victory often came with unexpected costs. Warren Caldwell's office was nothing like the glass and steel palace Blake had commanded. It was old-fashioned, with dark wood paneling, leather chairs worn soft with age, and shelves lined with actual books instead of designer accessories. Grace sat across from Warren, cradling a cup of tea, feeling more at peace than she had in months. The twins were with her sister for the afternoon, giving Grace a few precious hours to handle business. She'd been CEO of Holloway Technologies for exactly 1 week, and the learning curve was steep, but she was determined to honor her father's legacy. "Your father was a planner," Warren began, his weathered hands folded on the desk. "Some people called him paranoid. I called him wise. He saw things others missed, patterns in human behavior that most people are too trusting to recognize." Grace leaned forward. "He knew about Blake from the beginning, didn't he?" Warren nodded slowly. "The first time Blake came to dinner at your house, your father called me afterward, said there was something off about the young man. Too smooth, too eager to please, too interested in the business side of conversations. But you loved him, and Nate didn't want to be the overprotective father who drove you away. So he stayed quiet, not completely quiet. He investigated, quietly, carefully. He discovered that Blake had worked at 2 previous companies, both times leaving under suspicious circumstances. Nothing provable, nothing that would hold up in court, but red flags nonetheless. Blake was ambitious without ethics. charming without substance. Grace felt her chest tighten. Why didn't Dad tell me? Warren's expression was gentle. Would you have believed him? You were in love. Young people in love don't listen to warnings. They see criticism of their partner as a tax on their judgment. Nate knew that forcing you to choose between him and Blake would only push you toward Blake. Grace realized Warren was right. At 26, wildly in love, and convinced she'd found her soulmate, she would have defended Blake against anyone, even her father. So what did he do instead? He built insurance. Warren pulled out a file folder, thick with documents. When Nate was diagnosed with cancer, he knew his time was limited. He worked with me to create a complex series of legal protections. The ownership documents you found were just the beginning. Warren spread papers across the desk. Grace saw trust documents, banking records, investment portfolios, all bearing her father's signature and dates from 5 years ago. Your father's early investors paid him about $500 million for a 20% stake in Holloway Technologies. Warren continued. Nate could have spent that money, invested it in the company, done anything with it. Instead, he put every penny into an irrevocable trust with very specific conditions. Grace's hands trembled as she picked up the trust document. What conditions? 2 requirements must be met for the trust to activate. First, you must be the CEO of Holloway Technologies. Second, Blake Sterling must be legally removed from any position of power or ownership in the company. Not just fired, legally barred. Both conditions are now met. Warren smiled. Both conditions are now met. Grace, as of this morning, when I filed the final paperwork, you have access to $500 million, tax-free, protected from creditors, untouchable by anyone including future spouses unless you explicitly add them to the trust. Grace felt dizzy. $500 million. It was an incomprehensible amount of money. I don't understand. Why go to such extremes? Because your father loved you more than anything in the world. And he knew that if Blake showed his true colors, you'd be left with nothing. Blake would take the company, the money, everything. Nate wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, you'd have the resources to rebuild your life. Warren pulled out one more document, an envelope, sealed with red wax, her name written in her father's distinctive handwriting. He gave me this 15 years ago, made me promise to give it to you only after Blake revealed himself to be the man Nate feared he was. Grace took the envelope with shaking hands. The wax seal cracked as she opened it. Inside was a letter, written on her father's personal stationery. My dearest Grace, it began. Grace's vision blurred immediately with tears. Her father's voice seemed to speak from the page, warm and loving even from beyond the grave. If Warren gave you this letter, then my worst fears came true. Blake hurt you, probably badly. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from that pain, sweetheart. I'm sorry I'm not there to hold you while you cry, to tell you that you're going to be okay, to remind you how strong you really are. But I want you to know something important, something I need you to understand in your bones. This wasn't your fault. You have a generous, loving heart, and Blake exploited that. He saw your kindness and mistook it for weakness. But generosity isn't weakness. Grace, it's strength. The world needs more people who lead with love instead of fear. Blake will teach you hard lessons about trust, about power, about the dark side of ambition. Learn those lessons. Let them make you wiser, but don't let them make you cruel. Don't let him steal your kindness. Don't let his betrayal turn you into someone who trusts no one and loves nothing. The money I left you isn't about revenge. Although I won't lie and say the idea of you using my resources to defeat him doesn't bring me satisfaction. The money is about rebuilding. It's about giving you the freedom to create something beautiful from the ashes of what he destroyed. Create a company that treats people with dignity. Build a life that makes you happy, not one that looks impressive to others. Show your children, if you have them, what real strength looks like. It's not domination. It's not winning at all costs. It's grace under pressure. It's rising after being knocked down. It's forgiving yourself for being human enough to be hurt. I don't know what your life will look like when you read this, but I know you, Grace. I know you'll take the pain Blake caused and transform it into something meaningful. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. Some people break when life crushes them. You, my darling daughter, have always been the kind of person who takes broken pieces and creates mosaics. I love you. Gracie, I'm proud of you. Even though I'm not there to say it, know that I believed in you. I believe in you still, wherever I am. You are capable of more than you realize. You are stronger than you think, and you are loved beyond measure. Be happy, sweetheart. Truly, deeply happy. You've earned it. Love always and forever. Dad. Grace read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Warren sat quietly, giving her space to grieve and process. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but her expression was determined. He knew, she whispered. He knew everything that would happen. He knew enough, Warren corrected gently. He knew Blake's type. He'd seen men like that destroy companies and families. He just wanted to make sure that when the storm came, you had shelter. Grace carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. What do I do now? Warren smiled. Whatever you want. That's the gift your father gave you. Freedom. The company is yours. The money is yours. Your future is yours. No one can take it from you again. Grace thought about sleeping peacefully at her sister's house, about the company that bore her family's name, about all the women out there who were going through what she'd survived, but without the resources she now had. I want to do something meaningful, she said. The Holloway Foundation, the work we're doing with women entrepreneurs, I want to expand it. 10 times, 100 times bigger. I want every woman who's been told she's nothing to know that she's everything. Warren nodded approvingly. Your father would love that. There's one more thing I need to do, Grace said, standing. I need to go see Blake. Warren raised an eyebrow. Are you sure that's wise? No, but I need closure, real closure, and I need him to understand that he didn't win. He didn't even come close. That evening, Grace drove to Cook County Jail, her father's letter in her purse like a talisman. She'd made an appointment to visit Blake, using her one allowed visit per week. She needed to look him in the eye one final time, not for him, for herself, because the woman who walked into that jail wasn't the broken wife he'd abandoned. She was the CEO of a thriving company, the mother of 2 beautiful sons, and the inheritor of a fortune built on love and foresight. She was Grace Holloway, and she was finally free. The visiting room at Cook County Jail smelled like industrial cleaner, barely masking the scent of too many unwashed bodies in too small a space. Grace sat at a metal table bolted to the floor, her hands folded calmly in her lap, waiting. Around her, other visitors spoke in low, urgent voices to inmates in orange jumpsuits, mothers crying to sons, wives pleading with husbands, children asking when daddy was coming home. Grace felt oddly calm. She'd been anxious on the drive over, second-guessing her decision to come, but now that she was here, she felt only clarity. This was necessary, not for Blake, for her. The door opened and Blake shuffled in, wrists cuffed, a guard close behind. Grace barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 20 pounds. His hair, always perfectly styled, was greasy and unkempt. His skin had a grayish tinge from lack of sunlight, but worst of all were his eyes. The confidence that had once blazed there had been replaced with something hollow and bitter. The guard uncuffed one wrist and secured it to a ring on the table before stepping back to a respectful distance. Blake stared at Grace with undisguised hatred. Come to gloat, his voice was rough, like he'd been screaming or crying. Maybe both. No, Grace said simply. I came to say goodbye. Blake laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Goodbye, Grace. You destroyed my life. You took everything from me. My company, my freedom, my future. And you came here to say goodbye like we're old friends parting ways. You destroyed your own life. Blake, I just stopped letting you destroy mine. He leaned forward, chains rattling. Those twins, Lucas and Riley, they're my sons, my blood. You can't just erase me from their lives. Grace kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. Actually, You signed away your parental rights in your original settlement offer. Remember the one where you offered me $2 million to disappear and never speak your name again? I didn't sign it, But you did. You filed it with the court as cured official position. The judge accepted it as a legal declaration of your intent to abandon your children. Blake's face went white, then red. That's not what I meant. That was just, it was a negotiating tactic. It was a legally binding document that you signed. Your attorney warned you about the language. I have the court transcripts. You said, and I quote, "I don't want any parental obligations. The children will be her responsibility alone." That's abandonment. Blake, clear and irrevocable. For the first time, Grace saw real emotion crack through Blake's facade. His eyes glistened with tears he was too proud to shed. "I could have given them everything," he whispered. "Private schools, connections, opportunities. I could have made sure they had the best of everything." "You couldn't give them the one thing that actually matters," Grace replied. "Love without conditions. Love that doesn't come with contracts and clauses. Love that doesn't evaporate the moment someone is no longer useful to you." Blake slumped in his chair, suddenly looking much older than his 38 years. "You think you're so much better than me. I don't think I'm better than you. I think I'm free of you. There's a difference." Silence fell between them. Grace could hear a woman crying at another table, begging someone named Marcus to tell her where the money was. She could hear the guards' radios crackling with static and codes. She could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that electrical buzz that seemed to be the soundtrack of every institutional building. "Why did you really come here, Grace?" Blake asked, his voice hollow. "If not to gloat, then what?" Grace took a breath. This was the hard part. The part she'd rehearsed 100 times on the drive over, but still wasn't sure she could actually say. "I came to tell you that I forgive you." Blake's head snapped up. "What?" "I forgive you, Blake, for the lies, for the betrayal, for trying to destroy me, for making me doubt myself, for the humiliation, the arrest, for giving birth in custody, for all of it. I forgive you." He stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "I don't want your forgiveness. I'm not giving you a choice. This isn't for you, it's for me." Grace leaned forward slightly. "I spent 6 years of my life loving a man who never really existed. The Blake I fell in love with was kind, ambitious but ethical. Someone who made me feel valued. That man was a performance. Wasn't he a role you played to get what you wanted?" Blake looked away, jaw tight, realizing that hurt more than anything else. Grace continued. "More than the divorce, more than the public humiliation. Knowing that the man I'd built my life around, the man I trusted completely, was just a fiction. That almost broke me." "But it didn't break you," Blake said bitterly. "Obviously. No, it didn't, because I realized something important. Your betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of your character. I wasn't stupid for loving you. You were cruel for exploiting that love. But if I hold on to anger about that, if I let your cruelty poison the rest of my life, then you still win. You still get to control me." Grace straightened in her chair, feeling the weight of her father's letter in her purse, feeling the memory of her son's tiny hands gripping her fingers. "So I'm letting it go, not because you deserve forgiveness. You don't. But because I deserve peace. My sons deserve a mother who isn't consumed by bitterness. The women I'm helping through the Holloway Foundation deserve to see that you can survive betrayal and come out the other side whole. So I'm forgiving you, and then I'm walking out of here and never thinking about you again." Blake's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down his cheeks. "The boys," he said, his voice breaking. Do they look like me?" Grace paused at the door, her hand on the frame. She could lie. Tell him the twins looked nothing like him. Hurt him the way he'd hurt her. But she just said she was choosing peace over bitterness. Time to prove she meant it. "Lucas has your chin," she said quietly. "Riley has your dark hair. They're beautiful. Blake, they're going to grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally. They'll know that family isn't about biology or obligation. It's about showing up. It's about being present. It's about love that doesn't come with strings attached." "Things I never learned," Blake said. So softly Grace almost didn't hear him. She turned back, surprised. Blake was staring at his cuffed wrist, tears falling onto the metal table. My father used to say I'd never amount to anything, he continued, voice hollow. Said I was weak, worthless, that I'd die a nobody. I spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong, building an empire, accumulating power, winning at any cost. And now I'm sitting in a jail cell, and all I can hear is his voice telling me he was right all along. For just a moment, Grace felt a flicker of pity. Blake wasn't evil. He was damaged, wounded in ways that had twisted him into someone who could only take, never give. Someone who confused domination with strength, possession with love. Blake, she said gently, I hope you find peace someday. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from conquering other people. The kind that comes from accepting in yourself. But you won't find that peace with me. That chapter of my life is closed. She walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. Grace, wait. She turned one last time. Blake's face was wet with tears, his expression raw in a way she'd never seen before. Are you happy? Really happy? Grace thought about her answer, about her son's laughter, about the women she was helping rebuild their lives, about walking into Holloway Technologies every morning and knowing she was honoring her father's legacy, about sleeping peacefully at night, no longer wondering when the next betrayal would come. Yes, she said, I am, for the first time in years. I'm genuinely happy. And Blake, that happiness has nothing to do with you. Not anymore. She left him crying at the table, chains rattling as he covered his face with his free hand. On the drive home, Grace rolled down the windows despite the cold November air. She needed to feel the wind on her face, needed the physical sensation of movement, of going forward. Her phone rang. Jenna. How did it go? It's done, so Grace said. Really, truly done. I feel lighter, Jenna, like I've been carrying this enormous weight and I finally set it down. Good, because I have news. Blake's attorneys finalized the plea deal this afternoon. 15 years, minimum security federal prison. He'll likely serve 12 with good behavior. He'll be 50 years old when he gets out, Grace said, doing the math. Everything he built will be gone, his reputation, his connections, all of it. Meanwhile, you'll be running a billion-dollar company and raising two remarkable young men. Grace thought about that, about the cosmic justice of it all. Blake had tried to erase her, and instead she'd eclipsed him so completely that in 10 years, people would remember Holloway Technologies, but struggle to recall the man who'd briefly stolen its name. Jenna, thank you for everything, for believing me when no one else did, for fighting for me. That's what friends do. Besides, I had a front row seat to the most spectacular comeback I've ever witnessed, worth every sleepless night. After they hung up, Grace drove through the darkening Chicago streets, watching the city lights flicker to life. She thought about her father, about his careful planning and fierce love, about Warren, who'd kept his promise across the years, about Tessa, who'd found the courage to choose truth over comfort. But mostly she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been, naive and trusting and willing to shrink herself to fit into Blake's world, and about the woman she'd become, tested by fire and emerging stronger. Grace pulled into her driveway in Lake Forest. Through the window, she could see her sister Emily playing with the twins on the living room floor. Lucas was laughing at something, his whole face lit up with joy. Riley was trying to grab his brother's toy, determined and fearless. Grace sat in the car for a moment, just watching her sons. They would never remember this time, these early months when their mother was fighting the battle of her life, but they would grow up with the results of that battle. A mother who taught them that kindness wasn't weakness, that trust, even when betrayed, was still worth giving, that falling down was inevitable, but staying down was optional. She got out of the car and walked into her home, into the warm light and her son's laughter. Behind her, the door closed on the past. Ahead of her was everything else. 6 months after Blake's arrest, Grace stood on a stage at the Chicago Hilton, addressing 300 women entrepreneurs. Lucas and Riley were with Grace's sister in the front row, babbling happily. Tessa sat next to them, now a trusted friend and the director of the Holloway Foundation. A year ago, Grace began, I lost everything, my husband, my home, my sense of self. I was arrested while pregnant. I gave birth in custody. I had every reason to give up. The audience was silent, listening. But something my father once told me kept echoing in my mind. He said, Grace, strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing up one more time than you're knocked down. I got knocked down hard, but I stood up, and then I helped other women stand up too. She gestured to the screen behind her, showing images of women the Holloway Foundation had helped. Single mothers who'd started businesses, abuse survivors who'd rebuilt their lives, women who'd been told they weren't enough, proving the world wrong. The Holloway Foundation exists because I learned something important. Your worst moment doesn't define you. How you respond to it does. Blake Sterling tried to erase me. Instead, he gave me purpose. The applause was thunderous. Grace smiled, feeling her father's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. After the speech, a young woman approached her. Miss Holloway, I just wanted to say thank you. I left my abusive husband last year. I had nothing. The foundation gave me a grant to start my graphic design business. I'm profitable now. I have custody of my daughter. You saved my life. Grace hugged her. You saved your own life. I just helped you see you could. That evening, Grace returned to her new home in Lake Forest. Nothing like the ostentatious penthouse. This house was smaller, filled with light, with a yard where the twins could play. She'd bought it with her own money, her father's gift. She checked her email. One message stood out, from Blake, against her better judgment. She opened it. Grace, I took the plea deal, 15 years. My attorney says I'll serve 12 with good behavior. I'll be 50 when I get out. Everything I built will be gone. I know you won't read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry, not for getting caught, not even for losing. I'm sorry for what I did to you. You deserve better. The twins deserve better. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that in the end, you won. Not because you destroyed me, because you refused to let me destroy you. That takes strength I never had. Be happy. Grace, truly happy. You earned it. Blake. Grace read it twice, then deleted it. She didn't need his apology. She'd already moved on. She walked to the nursery, where Lucas and Riley were sleeping in matching cribs. They were 6 months old now, growing fast. Lucas had Blake's dark hair. Riley had Grace's lighter shade. Both had her father's eyes. Your grandpa would have loved you, she whispered. He left you more than money. He left you a legacy, kindness, integrity. The belief that business can be built on trust, not deception. She thought about everything she'd been through. The betrayal, the public humiliation, the arrest, the birth in custody. All of it had been brutal, but it had also been transformative. Grace Holloway had entered that storm as someone's wife. She'd emerged as herself. The next morning, she received a call from Forbes. They wanted to interview her for their Women Who Are Changing Business issue. We're calling you a titan of industry, the editor said. Grace Holloway, who took back her father's company and turned it into a force for good. Grace smiled. I'll do the interview on one condition. You also profile Tessa Vaughn. She's doing incredible work with abuse survivors. Deal. That afternoon, Grace stood in the boardroom at Holloway Technologies, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The same view she'd had a year ago, but everything was different now. Her assistant knocked. Miss Holloway, the board is ready for your presentation. Grace gathered her notes. She was proposing a new initiative, mentorship programs for women in tech, scholarships for single mothers, ethical business practices that prioritize people over profit. The board would approve it. They always did. Grace had proven herself over and over. As she walked into the boardroom, she thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd defined herself by her husband's success, who'd believed love meant sacrifice and silence. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more powerful. Not because she'd won a corporate battle, but because she'd won the war for her own soul. Grace Holloway had been knocked down, arrested, humiliated, and broken. But she'd stood back up, rebuilt her life, and created something beautiful from the ashes. And that, more than any business success, was her greatest victory. Outside the boardroom windows, the sun broke through the clouds. casting golden light across the city. A new day, a new beginning. Grace smiled and began her presentation. She had a future to build,